Welcome to the Nashville Current Podcast. I am your host, Ed Clay, with Deddrick Perry and a very, very special guest, State Representative Harold Love. Harold, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. I know that you just got out of some budget meetings. And Deddrick, why don't you start us out with some questions?
Absolutely. Now, Harold, our audience, for anybody who doesn't already know you, there's a lot of new movers in Middle Tennessee. You come from a very historic family in leadership in Nashville, Middle Tennessee. Maybe tell us a little bit about your family's background.
Thank you. For me, talking about my family background really talks about how people have overcome obstacles in their own situation to get to where they were. My father served in the General Assembly for about 26 years, from 1968 to 1994. And this was right around the period of time of civil rights movement legislation being passed. And so to have a Black state representative in Nashville was very important, because we had only had about 2 prior years of having representation from Nashville by a Black person, because prior to that, we had a situation where in Tennessee, those lines had not been redrawn for about 60 years. And so even though with the census occurring every 10 years, they had not redrawn the line, so Black folks could not get elected on the state level. So he was elected in 1968, and I lived his story because he grew up very impoverished here in Nashville on Scoville Street. Matter of fact, he, like many other people, had the interstate take his house. And so to be able to come up through that situation and to better himself with his education at Tennessee State and later on at Fisk University, and then as an insurance salesman for Atlanta Life Insurance and later on Prudential, had some folks who called him and said, listen, there's a seat opening up on the Metro Council. So he ran for that in 1961 and won that. And then later on got elected to the State House in 1968. So his service began as just trying to help his community. My mother, from West Tennessee, from Fayette County, Somerville, Tennessee, grew up on a farm in West Tennessee, came to Nashville to go to Tennessee State University, graduated with a degree in mathematics, and began to teach school in some of the local schools around the state, and then found herself working at Tennessee State as a math professor. And then she discovered that her math students didn't have the requisite skills to really get out of class and graduate. And so she took on the task of becoming the executive director for the Upward Bound program. And she did that for 47 years. So a total of 57 years working at TSU. And so for me, my parents, set the standard for how we should give back to our community and how we should not let the obstacles in front of us determine where our future is going to be.
Excellent, man. Now, you started your career in government when, Harold?
2012, I won my first election. A lot of folks don't realize until I tell them I lost my first 3 elections. I ran for election in 1998 at the age of 26, lost. Ran in 2000, lost. Ran in 2007, lost by 17 votes. And so when I encounter people who run for office and lost, I encourage them. I say, listen, I lost my first 3 elections. It took me 4 times to get elected. And so if you have that drive and determination inside of you and you think this is what you should be doing, I encourage people, go back and improve yourself, and then, the folks may elect you.
Excellent, man. So what has that experience of attempting to take the leadership role and coming so close? I remember that 17 vote situation. Yeah. I remember that. How has that framed how you lead now that you're actually in office?
So I will say this to you, because this experience at our university. Sometimes when you enroll in a class and you got to wait in long lines, you got to keep all your paperwork together and make sure that you have all your documentation. It hones your skills to be very determined to get out of class and get out of school and to graduate, and then return back and help somebody else. And so I use the framework of what I did at Tennessee State to also to inform my decision for running for office. And so for me, the issue was about not giving up, because I believed I had something to offer our community. But there's a larger piece there where it talks about how you can do something outside of office that you would have done in office. And I want to give credit to a man named Sonny Dixon. He's a preacher here in Nashville, Tennessee. After my second loss, he said to me, Harold, do outside the office what you would do in the office. And so he said, if you want to improve the education system, why don't you tutor kids after school. If you want to improve your neighborhood, organize some cleanups to clean the streets up and to offer services to people in the neighborhood. And so when I started doing that, then it enabled me to demonstrate my leadership capacity and capabilities to the community. And when they saw me out there doing outside of the office what I want to do in the office, then they had more faith in my potential leadership skills.
Got it. Give us an idea of geographically where your district is.
So I think I probably have one of the more diverse districts in Nashville. I have 7 colleges and universities in my district.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so my district spans from South Nashville, right around Gale Lane. And so some folks will know the area over there by Melrose, that area, all the way up to Gallatin Road. And so I get that area. I get 12 South. I get Murfreesboro Road. So that Trevecca University gets in my district. I also get part of East Nashville. And so I have the section of East Nashville from North 1st to North 9th, Cleveland Streets, Joseph Avenue, all those streets over there, Winfrey's Barbershop in my district. Also go to Gallatin Road and have the Lincoln College of Technology in my district. And of course, I have historic Jefferson Street, which means I have from Rosa Parks all the way up to 40. So I get Fisk University, I get Meharry Medical College, I get Tennessee State University, but then I also come over to Trinity Lane on the east side of town and pick up American Baptist College and have that area over there. So I get also part of the Gulch. And so I have the area over Music Row and half of that area over there. So I have also have the state fairgrounds. And so I get that, right? I get that part of the district. And so it is very diverse, but it also gives me a chance to really talk about when I say I want to affect the health and education and economy of Nashville. You know, my district represents a good part of that.
Right. It's got to be interesting being a state level lawmaker and your district's right, basically right in the center of the city. I want to talk about a little bit, like recently Nashville experienced, storms, tornadoes, and, that happened in addition to this global pandemic that we're in. Maybe give us an idea about how people in our district, your district, have been coping with and what the recovery efforts look like from just specifically the storms.
Sure. So thank you for that. One of the things that happened when the tornado hit is that we know that it hit East Nashville area. We know that it hit Hermitage, Mount Juliet, but also it hit North Nashville tremendously hard. And one thing that people should take note of is because of the density of the North Nashville area, because where the houses are located right close to each other, when the tornado came through, it really took out a good number of the houses, but also damaged a good number. And so I know for me particularly, when I saw what happened in the 2010 flood, when I was pastoring a church on West Hamilton, I noticed how many of the services from the federal government and from the city and the state did not come to that area fast enough. My church was up and providing relief efforts for about 4 days before we even saw FEMA or any of the services. So when the tornado hit, Councilman Brendan Taylor reached out to me and he asked me if I would be willing to let Lee Chapel on D.B. Todd be a relief site for the city. And so I first wanted to make sure that I was not overstepping my bounds and made sure that, that there were other opportunities for people to open up. But what we found was the locations where the city wanted to open up were not in walking distance of the people that were hit. And so I said, listen, if we can be of service to you, we certainly will. And I wanted to make sure that I maintained my position as a state representative and not overstep the bounds of the Metro Councilman who was going to be directly in there working with people. So what I did was we allowed them to use our church. Of course, we didn't have any power, but we found a creative way to hook a generator up from Metro government to power the church enough to provide lights and to provide some air conditioning as the workers came in there to provide supplies for people. And I think the design of the church really allowed us to also project to the city the image of what we saw down there and to allow us to say and to point and say, listen, don't let what happened in 2010 to Black people happen in 2020 with this tornado. Don't let FEMA come in late. Don't let Metro government come in late. And also don't let people come in and not want to provide good services, but instead trying to gouge people on things like cutting down trees. And so we had to have a couple of community meetings. I want to give a shout out to the Equity Alliance who helped us organize a community meeting on a Sunday night to say to people, not only don't sell out your house. But more than that, be careful about the contracts you're talking to, because we found that many people were being approached by, when I say contracts, I mean not developers, but contractors and people who would cut down trees, people who provide services. We found people almost being gouged out of tens of thousands of dollars just for having trees cut down. And so for us, it was about getting a volunteer base to get in and say, we'll help you with these things so you don't have to pay for these things.
How's the neighborhood recovering now? I mean, because we had the tornado, then a week later, basically, you had the COVID.
Right.
Yeah.
And
so
how's it going?
That caused a tremendous stop to the efforts, because literally what you had was, once we got FEMA in there and had FEMA taking applications, we had so many organizations coming in, we had insurance agents coming in. Then when COVID-19 hit, literally FEMA had to pull out. They had to go back to the various homes and DC sometimes. So what we had also was the inability to keep that process going. So there was a huge pause there. And I want to give a shout out also to Gideon's Army, who came in and did some tremendous work to maintain the flow of supplies being given to people in the area, to make sure that they were able to get groceries and to get cleaning supplies while COVID-19 was shutting everything down. You see now what is going on is there is a bit of a ramp up going on now, because there's more opportunities for folks to be out and having conversations with their insurance agents, and also to have conversation with contracts about, when can you start with this process. We made sure that we paid for some of the demolition of houses and the hauling up of debris while people were still shut down.
What are some of the organizations? Because a lot of people want to know how to help, still, and we can't forget about what happened with the tornado just because we've been through so much with COVID. What are some of the organizations that have made the biggest difference, in your area?
So you have Gideon's Army, of course, that is doing a tremendous amount of work. They've just purchased a grocery store in the area also. And so they're going to start working on that situation. Of course, Equity Alliance was a great help. Jefferson Street Missionary Baptist Church did some great work. Greater Heights Missionary Baptist Church over there. You had the Disciples of Christ Church over there. New Covenant with Reverend Dr. Judy Cummins came in, and they're right there in the community. You also had the Jefferson Street United Merchants Partnership that was doing some work. And even as far as the Northwest YMCA provided some opportunities for folks to stay at the Y for the first few days until the Metro shelter got up and running. And let me, of course, tip my hat to Chief Swan with the fire department and the Metro Office of Emergency Management, who did a tremendous job in getting everything organized, and also to NES, who DeCosta Jenkins, who did a wonderful job getting power back on as fast as they could. That was a tremendous help, because we knew people were without power, and getting groceries and supplies every day was going to be no good if they didn't have power to keep those groceries cool. The mayor's office tremendously helped us out, and the Frisk Foundation and the Community Foundation, Middle Tennessee. But boots on the ground was those first organizations I listed out who came in, and NAACP did some work also. So, and let me say this: Urban League provided a tremendous amount of help, because as they're talking about organizing efforts to carry on the work, that was a great deal of help that was given.
Great. Go ahead, Deddrick.
Awesome. So with the recovery from the storms being halted, all of our lives, everything that we were all going through before COVID, it gets put on pause.
Sure.
How does this new storm of COVID, this figurative storm of COVID, when it arrives, how has that affected your district, your constituents?
So COVID was very problematic, because you got that pocket of North Nashville who is already been affected before the tornado. And by affected, I mean affected by having high unemployment rates, also having issues with crime, and issues of being disenfranchised politically. So take that storm, right? Then add to it the tornado. So that's two. Then you add to it COVID-19, right? Which is saying that Black people are being disproportionately affected because of pre-existing conditions. So we're trying to get folks tested. Then I'm gonna add a fourth storm to you. We have the census that has to be filled out. And so literally, when we're talking about get counted, because being counted affects federal relief for the next 10 years, we're trying to push that narrative, but there are literally no mailboxes to receive the census form for, right? There is no internet connection for people to call in and to fill their form out online or on the phone. So you had that storm of that piece, with COVID-19, with the tornado, with the prior disenfranchisement, with the census being important to fill out. And so many of us had to just keep reminding people that indeed help is on the way, stick with us. And even when we moved some of our supplies to Robert Churchwell School as a larger place to receive supplies, again, we had to shut down that because of COVID-19, because we did not want to expose people, because, you know, in the early stages of COVID-19, as far as the response, we weren't really sure how exactly it might be transmitted, right? We were sure about how it may be transmitted in conversations, but, you know, how long would it stay on a piece of wood? How long would it stay on a piece of metal? How long would it stay on a piece of paper? And so having these conversations was very difficult because we had hands on Nashville trying to organize volunteers, yet we had COVID-19 concerns because you're literally working right by somebody and you don't know if, you know, they may be asymptomatic, or, you know, if their cough is just from the debris in the cleanup, or if their cough is from COVID-19. So all these factors, you know, put in there. And then, you know, for me as a state representative, I'm trying to figure out these issues as we're talking about coming back into session to pick the budget back up. And then George Floyd is murdered.
Mm. So this is just storm after storm after storm after storm after storm. You know, how have you held up personally?
So for me, I have been okay to deal with all these things. I had a great support system. You know, the community around me. My wife has been great because she's been helping out with things like she went and manned the church office just to make sure that the church office was separate from the tornado relief. I said, no, don't come back here with this, right? This is up here. The church does operate for other stuff, but also helping out with conversation about COVID-19. There's also a great deal of support from the community because they recognize, I think, that, you know, I need a break from time to time during the day to just reset and talk about these issues, because you got to keep in mind, you know, what George Floyd's death did was shine a spotlight on what we've been talking about for years. So when we talk about George Floyd's death, we go to the very beginning and say, well, this is why you talk about 37208 North Nashville area, East Nashville area, and South Nashville area where Black folks live, being disenfranchised. When you talk about housing issues, you talk about education issues, and you talk about, you know, even something that came out during the tornado was issues with insurance policies, right? Many times the houses in North Nashville were not properly insured for the value that they had, because what I had insured for in 2015 was not the value in 2020. So my replacement cost is higher than what my insurance policy is. And these issues we're talking about are still related to this issue of racism in our society, because you had insurance companies that, you know, didn't do the proper reevaluation and come back in and make sure that your policy is up to par.
Wow. You know, there's something about the George Floyd. You mentioned that this is something that we have been talking about for years, of course. The idea of police brutality, police killing Black men is nothing new, unfortunately, in America. Something about this feels different. I've heard that. I experienced that. There's something about this particular case that feels different. Do you share that sentiment? And if so, why? What do you think it is?
So I think the image of George Floyd's death is what made it different. Keep in mind that when I talk about issues that have been, you know, burning up in many of us for many years, you got to really go back to, again, the housing piece. Federal Housing Administration, literally in their policy, said that they would not subsidize the building of houses in Black neighborhoods. So you got a contractor that wants to build a house in a Black neighborhood. They say, well, we won't provide any subsidy or insurance for your process. So we won't undergird you to help you build this house. Yet we'll do it in a white neighborhood. And then we'll tell the white contractor in the white neighborhood, the caveat for you getting this money is you cannot sell to Black folks. Yeah. So then you have pockets of neighborhoods that are, you know, unsubsidized with housing, and so they're undervalued. And then you have the issues of education. You have HBCUs that are underfunded at tremendous levels than predominantly white institutions. And so what you have was this building of this process. And so when I say the image of the Floyd killing, what I'm talking about is the fact that when you look at the officer's disregard, not just for George Floyd's life, but for all those who are also pleading for his life, then we talk about the disdain that not just police in certain situations might have, but also educators. Because I've told many times, my friends, listen, you can't just eliminate police brutality. You also must eliminate implicit bias in the classroom. Like here in Nashville a couple of years back, for kindergartners, right, who were expelled from school or suspended, kindergartners, 100% of them were African American. Now, how is it every child that's suspended is Black in kindergarten, right? And then elementary school, 2/3 of the students were Black. And so when we talk about getting our country to a place where everybody's treated better, I think, again, the Floyd piece, the Floyd murder, was one in which, because of the disdain of look on the officer's face, it represented, the years of disdain that folks have talked about when you talk about underfunding of schools, when you talk about neighborhoods that were not worth anything until, I'll be clear with you, the Kroger on Monroe, it's beautiful now.
Right.
A couple of years back, I'm just, this is just real talk. The selection of food, right, was much different. And so you talk about food deserts in North Nashville and South Nashville, East Nashville, right? When you talk about how many grocery stores are in a given area, these affect health outcomes, because if people can't get fresh fruits and vegetables, then their body's going to be prone to certain health disparities.
Going to the George Floyd thing, when we'll probably get into the police brutality and the possibility of changing some different laws. But, one of the things that struck me, and I was playing it through my head, I play that, you can kind of see it. I can see it in my head, what happened over and over and over again. And I thought, what would I do if I were in that situation? If I were watching that, would you because, you're kind of torn, because, if you tackle a cop, you're done. You can't do that. But then you're almost like allowing them to kill somebody, but you don't know that he's going to die. So I would hope that when we're talking about legislation change, I'm not saying people should tackle cops. They could open up a can of worms as well.
Right.
But there's got to be some type of logical conversation that we can have, that if we're watching that, we don't feel like our lives are over by jumping in or doing something. What are some ideas in that situation that could be done from a legislative standpoint or training standpoint that could make a difference?
So I actually had a bill that I was proposing, but could not get it in its proper form before we left in July. I'm going to bring it back in January when we get back in session. And that bill specifically addresses other peace officers, as we refer to them, who are in the vicinity of this happening. And so what we say now is the peace officer, the other three who are standing there, right, or engaged in the process, it's now required of them to engage their colleague, right? That's the first thing. And so that's the building of this mindset that you can't do that. Also is the elimination of chokeholds. So it's a step-by-step process. So if you eliminate, so it's almost like looking at the George Floyd murder and walking back, to your point, and enacting legislation that prevents this from happening. So now we say you cannot use chokeholds, period. There is no loophole behind that. Secondly, if the officer is there and observing another officer conducting themselves in a manner which they believe might end the life of this person, then the other officer is obligated to engage in doing it. And here's what I want people to understand is a vital part of what all happened right there. You have 4 lives that are, changed forever. 4 or 5 lives changed forever because of the action of one and the inaction of others. Right? And so you have the action of one who is in the process of killing, but the inaction of others, right, now causes the Floyd family, the police officer who killed him, and the other 3 who were there, their lives are affected forever. And so what we're saying is, don't let this happen again. And part of what we do in making policy, and I want your listeners to understand this, we cannot change a person's biases, but we can make the acting upon those biases to deprive someone else of their own future illegal.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're talking about doing, is making sure that, you know, people, you can think what you want about me.
Mm-hmm.
In your mind, you can think what you want about me, but what you cannot do is legally deprive me of my education, deprive me of opportunity to have home ownership, and deprive me of opportunity to live. And so that's what we talk about when we make policy, is that making sure, and that's what I want folks to understand, nobody's taking away your freedoms, but your freedom cannot hinder my freedom also.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what happened, or what happens with police officers, is in the past, you know, if they say something to another police officer, you know, they get in trouble, you know, and they have that blue shield or those type of things. So I guess in the legislation, it'd be good to somehow, you know, relieve them of something like that, figure
Sure.
out a way to make it to where they don't feel like they lose their career, even though it's the right thing to do.
Right.
You know, the system is such that they would be harshly punished if they did that. So like,
Yeah.
are you kind of working something like that into the bill?
Yeah, and proactively, we're also saying that we want to give peace officers a chance to also decompress from the day that they've had. And think about this. When you're out there and you are encountering other parts of the population that are not trying to do what is right, when you're trying to prevent crime or prevent someone, when you're trying to keep me from getting assaulted and you encounter the assailant, right? The level of stress you have, and you may have wrestled with that assailant and gone the right way and put them in the car. I don't want you to take that stress and then encounter a young Black male who is walking down the street with a hoodie on.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to be able to decompress before you encounter him. Because much of what we don't talk about is the mental health of our peace officers as they're out there trying to deal with the stress of a job. And all of us have experienced it. No one is free from this. Whenever you've had an argument with somebody else, right, and you didn't get to come out that argument like you wanted to, or maybe you did, the next person you encounter oftentimes gets the brunt or the residue of what you just left.
Yes. Well, we were
Right?
talking about that last week with Vincent Dixie, you know, how, and he brought up a good point. We need better mental health across the board in the Black communities as well. He's like, police, because I brought up the police officer point. He said, well, but, you know, think about the Black children that have seen some horrible things as well. How do we, you know, address mental health across the board?
Yep.
But to your point about the, you know, the police officers needing, you know, mental health work, you know, if you think about soldiers, you know, they get to decompress. Cops generally don't. So, you know, acknowledging that and saying, hey, mental health is an important issue
Sure.
for the police, because really they can't have a bad day. They can't
Right.
have a bad day. You know, they have one little slip, or one slip could be a giant slip that, you know, affects a lot of people's lives.
Yeah. And I don't want us to miss the opportunity to talk about this piece where, how does the officer who killed George Floyd get made? How is he created, right? And that's why I keep on going back to this issue of education, because if you have instances where Black bodies are devalued across the board in education, in housing, and in healthcare, that shapes the mind of someone about how they view somebody. Stereotypes begin to develop. And part of our task is to make sure that people who are not strong enough to push back against those stereotypes are not given those stereotypes in their upbringing. Because think, children are not born, right, with these biases. That's why when you see children at daycares of all hues and colors, they play together. But then when they are indoctrinated with these biases, again, poor housing, right, in Black neighborhoods, poor education, schools in Black neighborhoods. When you're indoctrinated with this, what happens, you develop this mindset that, well, it must be less than valuable, because look at where they live, look at where they go to school, the other thing that they're receiving. So our task has to be a wholesale reform of the system, because it does us no good to, again, root out it in the police department if it's still alive in the school system, if it's still alive in the judicial system, if it's still alive in the corporate world. right? So we have to root it out in all areas, and it starts with education and about increasing the value of Black bodies.
Well, I know Deddrick's going to ask some questions about that specifically. I just want to hit on one more on the police front. Training to me is an issue. I was a professional fighter. I trained professional fighters. So I don't know what it's like to walk down the street and not know that I can fight with my hands or that. That said, the killing in Georgia, you had 2 cops that were getting whooped by one guy. To me, that shooting should have never happened if they were properly trained in self-defense, like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or other things. What can we put in place at a state level to where officers are required to have, I mean, I'm talking about like blue belt level of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, black belt level of karate, like, really good training, at least a year of 3 days a week of hand-to-hand combat, to where they don't need to. If I were attacked on the street and I didn't know any self-defense and I was a cop, I would have, you're afraid, you don't know how to fight. I can't imagine not knowing how to fight being a police officer.
So I think we have to balance that training also with what we call the proper use of force. Because we don't want to train a police officer in these blue levels, and then they've got not the chokehold that we worry about, but it's the other things they'll use to an excess. And so we have to balance it all. And so I think that may be a good idea, which would give them more confidence in their ability to defend themselves without using the taser or the gun or the baton, but then also educate them on how to de-escalate force. Because here's what's happening. The training of an officer is almost like, and I'll say the training of doctors, right? And I'm gonna make a comparison. I hope that comes out all right. Officers are trained to use enough force to get the particular person to comply, right? And if they don't comply at the first level, they escalate it up higher to get them to comply. Years ago, doctors were instructed to prescribe medicine to relieve pain, right? Just give them what they need to stop hurting. And then we end up with an opioid crisis because doctors would say, well, this is what we were trained to do. So now they're having to be retrained and say, well, don't prescribe the medicine to relieve pain, right? Because we don't want any more folks addicted to opioids, but try to find some other way to prescribe the medicine in a manner that alleviates some pain, but also allows them to get, to stop being addicted. So in the same way, we must train officers to not escalate force, but to also de-escalate force and know the proper use of it.
Sure. Right. And I guess what I'm saying is with that training, I completely agree. My experience is when people actually know how to defend themselves, though, they use way less force. I mean, you're not going to see me swinging on people. I'm going to try to get the fight to the ground, pressure. If I were a cop, hands behind their back, and I wouldn't need all of the punching in the face and those type of things, to do that.
I'll tell you what, I'm open to maybe sometime in the fall having a conversation as we start to write this bill up to talk about how that might be, maybe use a department locally as a pilot or test study.
Sure. Yeah, I know the martial arts schools. I shouldn't say I know, but I would think the martial arts schools locally be open to doing something at little to no cost to training them, because everybody, like I shouldn't say everybody, but most people want to make a difference right now and see that there's issues with this. And I think that they would want to be a part of that. So
I appreciate that.
Yes. Yeah. Harold, your example almost segued into kind of like my next question. You talked about the opioid epidemic. Let's just get down to it. When are we going to legalize cannabis in Tennessee? When is that going to happen?
I'm going to tell you, oddly enough, man, I think this COVID-19 shutdown has pushed the conversation a little bit further from this perspective. This is one thing that will always be true in government and politics. Money is a primary motivator of policy change. Mississippi, as good-willed as they are, I think was more influenced by the SEC's threat of not having championship games there and the NCAA's threats of not having championship games in Mississippi to remove that state flag. Because notice the timing, right? Everybody been saying, take the flag down, take the flag down.
Right.
All of a sudden, SEC and NCAA say, well, tell you what, if you don't take it down, no championship game. Let's bring that bill back up here. Let's go ahead and vote this thing down, right? And so in the same vein, what you have is states that had low revenue. And I said this a couple of years back when the gas tax revenues first started to decrease. When you had hybrid and electric cars on the highways, what you did was you reduced the amount of gas tax that was coming to the federal government because you didn't have cars using as much gas, right? You had more cars being electric. So it reduced the gas tax revenues, which is why Tennessee had to increase its gas tax. Other states did also. So that moved us to a place where we had to find different sources of revenue. In the same vein, when you have states now trying to recover from COVID-19 shutdown, we had almost $1 billion in a revenue shortfall in Tennessee. We had to go back and cut some things. And I say that because that's a different source of revenue with cannabis that can be taxed, cannabis that can be brought in as a different revenue source. So I think that we may have some colleagues who look at that approach as a means to increase a different revenue or implement a different revenue supply.
Right. Now, Harold, correct me if I'm wrong, but historically you have been one of the lawmakers that has, walked or presented cannabis reform or cannabis legislation to the state legislature.
Yeah.
What do you believe, and I know you can't read anybody's mind, but what do you believe is the motivating force behind those who are opposed to cannabis legislation?
Yeah, we use this phrase in the legislature that we enact laws because of things that make us mad, and sometimes we make laws because of things that we're afraid of. And so, for me, I think the major motivator is this fear that cannabis is a gateway drug, that it opens up the pathway for someone to use drugs. And I have tried to counter the argument by saying this. Part of the problem with drug sentencing guidelines is that when you make a half ounce of marijuana a felony after the first 2 arrests, half ounce or less, right? And so, or less is residue. So when you make that a felony, you do several things. One, you then cause the person who might be selling marijuana to say, well, if that's going to be a felony, I may as well sell a harder drug.
Mm-hmm.
If the jail time is going to be the same, right? The risk versus reward. Secondly, what you do is you potentially, put a person in jeopardy of losing student scholarships if they have residue found in the car, because the first 2 arrests are misdemeanors and the third one is felony. And of course, people respond by saying, well, we didn't make them do anything. They chose that lifestyle. And that's okay. I'll tell you what, then understand this, that because of a lot of people's socioeconomic situations, they end up finding coping mechanisms in life. They're under stress, they're having problems, and they choose sometimes the wrong vehicle to cope with their stress. So that's part of the issue. Now, the other issue, the motivating money factor, is a lot of your pharmaceutical companies don't want to lose the economic advantage they have with the drugs they are currently using or prescribing to relieve pain. And so what you have is you have this new, not new in a sense because it's been around forever, but you have this new pain relief product, right, that could potentially cause cancer persons to not be in so much pain. But if you use that, it's going to cut into the profits of this other drug that's already legal. And so I think there are multiple things out there, but the biggest thing is this fear of having people walk down the street smoking marijuana, right? And the image of that, having people driving in cars and smoking marijuana. And so I think the imagery of it is why my approach oftentimes was, I was for the better sentencing guidelines and not necessarily the legalization, because I didn't believe that it made sense to send someone to jail for possession of a half ounce or less. I didn't think that it made sense to double someone's sentence for drug possession in a school zone at 3 a.m. when school is not in.
Right. Well, think about the impact that it would make to legalization for for those that have been really affected by it. Also, whenever I hear the whole it's a gateway drug thing, to me it doesn't. I mean, I hear the argument. To me, it doesn't make sense because, would you rather someone go and buy something from a state regulated facility, or would you rather them go to a drug dealer who might have other harder drugs like cocaine or heroin, these other things? Talk about gateway. They're being introduced to a whole nother world they might not be introduced to before. And to me, it's a lot safer.
Sure. Now, to your point also, if we ever get to the conversation of legalizing marijuana in Tennessee, one thing that must be dealt with is how do we then deal with persons who are incarcerated for the same drug that's now legal? Secondly, how do we deal with persons who will be released from jail for selling the same drug? Are we going to make sure that they can then participate in the process of now distributing the legal drug? Because for me, that's wrong to deny them the opportunity, because what they were doing is now legal, but they're out of jail now, but you're going to deny them a chance to participate in the legal form of it just because they were in jail for the illegal form of it.
And to me, this is a chance for, quite frankly, white legislators to make a big difference fast. Like now is the time. Everybody sees, I think, the discrepancies and the issues, how Black communities are in large ways, disenfranchised. Why not take the jump? Let's legalize it, skip the medical, legalize it, let the people out of jail, clear their records, and let's figure out how to help people get a better education while we're at it.
Yeah. It's again, because, you have people who are afraid of what this genie out the bottle would do. Mm-hmm. And that is, unfortunately, again, fear motivates. You don't know how many times I've been in a committee and we discussed a piece of legislation and I've asked the question, is this happening? No, but it might. And it's not even dealing with cannabis, it's dealing with another range of stuff. And I said, well, we're passing this bill because something might happen. Yeah, it's coming. I said, well, why don't we wait until it gets here or gets closer at least? And so a lot of it is fear. And I would dare say that, a lot of it is driven by people who have vested interest in, again, maintaining the status quo.
Well, the status quo isn't working, and it's painful right now. To me, it's painful. I think I was talking a few weeks ago that I think everybody's hurting right now. We're all feeling pain, and we've got to make meaningful change right now. And there's never been a better time, at least in my lifetime that I know of, to make that meaningful change and to let fear go, and let's go with faith for once. If we've been so afraid, it's time to go with a little bit of faith.
Yeah, I'm gonna tell you, and a lot of it, even look at the numbers of people who voted, right? People who voted in the last presidential election is such a tremendously low number compared to those who live in the country. And that's dangerous on a federal, state, and local level, because what happens then is those who are the loudest voices end up influencing policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
so if you want change, what you have to do now is you got to start getting people who are already registered to vote to make this their priority and contact their like-minded colleagues in other parts. I guarantee you, if you had 2,000 people in every primary election across the state saying to their state representatives, I want you to legalize marijuana, at least just for medical use, right? And make that one of their top priorities, along with education, along with workforce development, then you see a change, because that's what happens. And so, these conversations all depend upon the elections.
Yeah, go ahead, Deddrick.
Yeah, so Harold, how can we cascade this idea that, this type of change needs to happen? And I'm just getting the sense that the wheels of government perhaps have not been lubricated to, facilitate an outcome that, people, perhaps the majority of people want, but it seems like we're a lot further away politically than we want to. How can people really, the average person who's like, you know, I'm in Middle Tennessee. I want to see this happen. You know, what can I do? What you said 2,000 people. How can I be one of those 2,000 people? What does that mean?
So, yeah, you can pull the records of every primary election in the state of Tennessee when someone is opposed, and you'll see that on average, about 2,000 people make up the difference in someone being elected or someone being the nominee in the primary. Whether you go to, right, whether you go to Anderson, sometimes it's smaller, right? So whether you go to Anderson County or whether you go to Grundy County or Davidson County, the gap is oftentimes less than 2,000 votes. Sometimes the gap is 50 votes and the number turning out is 2,000, right? Because what happens, we focus so much on the presidential election and the governor's race, and we don't realize it's the state legislature that affects your life. And so again, if you can contact your friends or like-minded folks in other counties, then I mean that's how these other special interests get their agenda on somebody's mind.
So you're saying that, you know, and I know I've been so I'm like a novice, organizer, but I know that special interest groups do target, certain, hotly contested races or opportunities really to influence where that gap is smaller. So that's, I'm understanding better where the 2,000 number came from. For people in Nashville who want to see real change in cannabis legislation, who should they be reaching out to? I mean, you already represent them and you're on the team.
Yeah.
But who else can they look to?
For the most part, it's not going to be the Davidson County delegation. They need to reach out to like-minded friends in other counties. They need to change the minds of the legislators west and east, and to a degree a little bit north of Davidson County. And here's the very truth of the matter. Legislators want to be reelected because they got a particular issue that they're working on, and they want to be there to work on that issue. None of us cover the broad range of 50 issues. Like for me, it's always going to be education. It's always going to be healthcare. It's always going to be criminal justice, right? Those are my main three I'm always working on. Now, I don't have the capacity, neither does anybody else have the capacity to work on 7 issues the same way. I got colleagues who their main issue is cannabis, right? So that's their main issue, but they don't have the support across the state because the other colleagues may have people saying, whatever you do, don't vote for that because you don't vote for them, I'll vote you out. And so that threat of being voted out keeps them from oftentimes doing the right thing by these other people when it comes to cannabis legislation. Keep in mind, the very source of our government is representative democracy, which means you elect me or you elect somebody else to represent you in that chamber. Now, that doesn't mean we have a town hall meeting on every vote, but it means that we are to be informed by you about particular things you want us to pass. And it's our job to kind of weigh those things out and figure out what's the best way to get those things done. Can it even be done, right? And is it cost effective? And so these are the things that will help get those measures passed.
Got it. So Harold, surrounding this and other issues, there's been a lot of conversation recently, especially since George Floyd. It just seems like the conversations that people are having have been more pointed. What do you feel is an appropriate or one of the better best practice vehicles to have a difficult conversation with someone who might have an opposing view, whether it be politically, economically? Because I see things turn negative so quickly. How can we
The best thing I would say is to have a conversation between a small group of folks and the elected official. It's been my experience that some of my most salient conversations have been one-on-one or 4 or 5 on one. When you get to 20 and 30, it's a bit difficult because sometimes explaining a position and understanding where someone is coming from can only occur in small group settings because you need to understand, well, where does Ed Clay come from? what's his background? What's his experience? What's Deddrick Perry's experience, and what informs him to think like he thinks? But if you get Ed and Deddrick and 70 people, and they want to talk to Harold Love about a bill or a piece of legislation, the first 3 or 4 questions might be on point and we can agree, but that 8th question,
right.
And then you're sitting there saying, I don't think maybe you didn't hear me right when I was explaining the other 3 about why I'm this way, and then because you may feel like you may feel as if you're not being heard, then you escalate, right? And then what happens, unfortunately, human nature, then I escalate. And then before you know it, all the goodwill, and that's been my experience. I've opened my doors to people whose view on a subject was totally opposite mine. But in my office, the 3 of us sat there and talked and respected our views. I disagreed with them, but then I watched that same person in a group of 70 people. It all went away.
Well, one of the things that I strongly believe in is we should be building bridges and not walls. How do we work together, and bringing different ideas and thoughts together? And it seems to me at this point, there's so much polarization. People are really afraid to talk. And, one of the goals with the Nashville Current and this podcast is really to have these conversations with views that we agree with and not agree with, but open conversations where we're not attacking we're not attacking the character or the come from, which happens a lot. And, I think now, and I know you got to go, Harold, but I think now is the time for, bridge building.
Sure.
I think especially between white and black people, I think white people are way more open across the state. They've got to. There's no way that certain state representatives or state senators that before were probably a little closed off, we haven't broken down that wall a little bit and said, hey, guess what? We got some stuff in common. Let's find some common ground. Let's make some real difference and change right now, not just for us, but for our kids and and I think that we have that opportunity. So with that, in closing, Harold, I'll listen to your remarks.
Well, I appreciate that. And thank you again for having me on the podcast. I think it'll go a long way to doing what we're talking about. And I've told many colleagues pre-George Floyd's murder, when we were dealing with the tornado, I said, here is a situation where at this moment in time, we've been blessed to be in spaces where we can make change, where we have heard from the past about what changes need to be made. And now we have this policy window open to make these changes. And so part of our responsibility, I think, is to keep these conversations going beyond November. Because oftentimes what happens is after a presidential election, people sit back, people assume the change is going to happen because the executive has changed, and then they fall by the wayside. We have to make sure that we stay engaged at every level, the local level with the school board, Metro Council, mayor's office, the state level with the state representatives and senators, the governors, and even the federal level. But more than that, to make sure that we are creating an environment in the city of Nashville that can be an example for other places to say, and look how people are valuing each other's lives, valuing each other's perspectives, and then also tearing down the myth out there. Because before you can reconcile, you must have truth. I tell folks all the time, don't believe the truth of Metro government was formed because property taxes were running low and the city and the county had to merge. No, the truth of the matter is this. Nashville was on its way to have a black mayor in 1970 era because black folks were increasingly populating Nashville and whites moved to Davidson County. And to avoid that, the state legislature, was concerned. And so they merged. The metropolitan government of Nashville was created out of that fear. And that drives so much of the fear. Fear drives so much of what we do in life. And we got to step back from that and move toward truth. And then we can reconcile. And the truth is, all of us can live in harmony if we value each other and again take time to appreciate each other's perspective, what brought us to where we are, and also going forward, as you said, for our children and our grandchildren to live in a place where we don't allow fear and anger to lead the way.
Well, thank you very much for that. Deddrick, you got anything as well that you'd like to say in closing?
Love in the house, man. It's great talking to you, Harold. Always.
Yes, sir. I appreciate y'all.
Absolutely. Harold Love, thank you very much. And thank you for watching the Nashville Current Podcast.